Now, Vishaan Chakrabarti, architect and founder of the Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, presents a flash talk on designing the Humane Urbane.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. So my sense in spending time with all of you and listening to many of these panels is that a lot of us share an aspiration that cities can be an engine of sustainability and equity, and especially in this time of technological dislocation. I mean, after all, those are kind of the three challenges, right? Sustainability, equity, and how we deal with technological dislocation. And I believed in this so much that about 7 years ago, I wrote a book that really talked about how important the growth of cities were, transit-oriented development. But I realized that that was a very technocratic answer to a lot of our problems. And so in the last 10 years, I've seen this huge amount of growth in cities and transit-oriented development. But the problem is, it's banal. And communities are reacting against it. And the reason they're reacting against it is, I think, because what we're building is we're building a lot of metropolis, but not a lot of cosmopolis. And that's a fancy word for this idea that a real city, a great city, is a place where people of all races, all genders, and all class, which may be the toughest one, can come together and meet eyeball to eyeball in the city. And this is not a new idea. The Greek city planner Doxiadis talked about this idea that every once in a while, a kind of person who feels quite different from everyone around them is born. And the reason they gravitate towards a city is they find more kind of strange people like themselves. And as they do that, they start innovating. They start creating ideas. And those ideas become contagious, and they start spreading across the city. And we actually have a lot of data that backs up this idea that Doxiadis talked about. But what that requires, again, is this idea of people meeting eyeball to eyeball. And our problem in the 20th century, of course, is the car, and we picked on the car a lot in this session, and I'm going to pick on the car some more. But not necessarily for the environmental reasons that the mobility panel talked about, but for the cultural reasons. Because you see, when you think about how much space the car takes up, and how much it segregates us from ourselves, from our communities. So I don't care whether those cars are autonomous or electric or Uber. There's still a rolling tin can that separates us from everyone else. And so much so that there are probably kids in the United States who think this is a street, right? And we think that streets were invented for cars. Streets were not invented for cars. They go back to antiquity. The arrangement of the grid in ancient China was about our relationship to order. In India, about our relationship to the cosmos. In Greek history, Hippodamus, the grid of Miletus was literally about a non-hierarchical system that represented democracy. In Rome, the creation of the Cardo and the Deco was the way in a vast empire that any Roman, anywhere they were in the world, could feel like they were in Rome. It was about identity. The laws of the Indies, the Spanish colonial powers across Latin America, used the grid to actually portray their power across that region. And then famously, in the mid-1800s, the Eixample, the Cerdà plan for Barcelona, which is one of the first plans that we know about that uses those chamfered corners actually to allow a motor vehicle that was, not a motor vehicle, excuse me, a vehicle drawn by a horse to take those corners faster, which is why those corners were cut. And that, of course, you know, the other example, you can look at the grid here in Chicago, the 1811 Commissioner's Grid in New York. And what you get is you get something that worked very well for those times of the pre-industrial era of row houses and horse-drawn carriages. But then soon after those grids are developed, huge inventions, elevator, structural steel, internal combustion engine, and all of a sudden, those pre-industrial grids don't work very well for our post-industrial world, and we try to break out of them. So Corbusier famously draws all sorts of crazy plans about ripping down half of Paris in order to accommodate this new world. And we in the United States passed the largest infrastructure act in the history of our country, the Federal Highway and Defense Act, which is not only about suburbanizing the population in the face of, suburbanizing and diffusing the population in the face of nuclear war, but also a huge racial kind of disparity that takes hold in terms of white flight. And so we end up with this, right, in the United States. And then we end up with this in India. And we end up with this in China, and we end up with this in in South Korea. And these are the awful places that we're building for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. Even though this is where we go on vacation, right? So, we go to the beautiful steps of Rome, we go to Shanghai, we go to Tokyo, to, these tight-knit, beautiful pre-car streets, to Fez in Morocco, to the favelas of Rio. These are the places where people actually want to be, these places that were designed and built before the automobile. And it was all about this idea of Cosmopolis, of seeing people eyeball to eyeball. So when you go to this and you say, wow, this is great, even though it's sinking, you also realize this is illegal. You can't build Venice anymore for a series, because of building codes, cost. Instead, what we've done is we've totally mechanized construction, so we're building the same building all over the world using the same materials. And so this is 6 downtowns in 6 continents around the world. And I don't care if it's transit-oriented. To use a technical term, it's crap. It's soul-crushing crap, right? And we're building this everywhere and wondering why communities hate it, right? Or you can go out to the suburbs, 6 suburbs in 6 continents, and it's the same thing. So look, we know that it's still important to build cities, to build people homes that are in denser circumstances, because it's a naturally lower carbon footprint. We know that that's still a good idea. But I think in the 21st century, we have to rethink, this whole paradigm. So first, let's start not just with technology, but the timeless factors. What makes us human? We're bipeds. We need light and air. We're still subject to the forces of gravity. These things are not going to change. At least not in my lifetime. But there are new things that we have to take advantage of. The fact that program is blurring and that people are working in a whole new way. The skyscraper is dying, and tech companies are gravitating towards horizontal buildings, not vertical buildings. The age of autonomous, not necessarily personal vehicles, but mass transit. And that means that maybe we can take the territory that we used to use for streets, and if they are truly autonomous vehicles, rethink space for human beings and actually start to create a pre-20th century world using 21st century technology. And that in our urban planning work, we're looking at how to do that and how to create much more humane environments and public spaces that are much more performative, that are much tighter grained using things like tall timber construction and other new technologies. But again, weather mitigated streets, things that again encourage people out eyeball to eyeball in the streets. But as we talk about walkable environments and bikeable environments, I also worry when I see a book that says we should Copenhagenize something. I'm from Calcutta. I don't want Calcutta to be Copenhagen. I'm very worried about this one-size-fits-all kind of solutions for things. And we are also understanding that we just had a big panel about affordability, that affordability is a problem in these more walkable places. They are more attractive, and they are therefore becoming gentrified. So we have a huge problem. And so I think part of the solution is, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples from our office, is that the territory, and this neighborhood we're in right now is a perfect example of this, that the central business district is breaking down. Google is here, they're not in the loop, right? So, this idea that the territory of the city is breaking down and becoming a place where work takes place in a lot of different places, and that within each of those nodes that maybe you could reach 80% of your daily needs in a 20-minute walk. And then the building then becomes something that's communicating in part of that node. So that's what we try to aspire to in our work. So this is an old building in the waterfront in Brooklyn where we're designing a 400,000 square foot commercial office building, a creative office building, where 10 years ago you never would have seen office space here. But it means that that workplace is closer to affordable housing, not the other way around, right? And this remaking of the old, so it's unmistakably part of that community. It has to be there, it can't be elsewhere. And how it relates to the ground plane. Near this, in East New York, one of the poorest parts of New York City, this is a project for a pastor in New York. It's 100% affordable housing. It's everything from transitional homeless housing all the way to workforce housing with a ground floor that is completely about social services, not so much about retail. And that there's aspects like a performing arts center, which is the kind of funky building you see in the background. And so this isn't just about affordable housing as widgets, it's about building community. and really making streets and spaces where people feel a sense of ownership and care and quality. And I'm just going to close with a place you probably didn't think you'd hear about today, Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, where I've been learning a lot from two of our projects there. One, a small office tower that's modeled after Genghis Khan's famous armor, with this idea of, this is the coldest capital in the world, it's really cold, and with this idea that the glass acts as a double skin coat of armor, so you can still have glass buildings, but the idea that that is, again, unmistakably Mongolian, it's actually recognizable to people as a form. Or this village that we're designing, 41 buildings, all without cars, with buildings that are made out of local construction techniques by the local community, again, unmistakably a part of the place, big thermal mass to protect against the cold weather, these colors that they use because the sky in Mongolia is spectacular, and again, materials that are local that people will immediately recognize as their own. So this idea that as you move around, you are eyeball to eyeball, you're in a cosmopolis, you're in a new place, it is growth, but it's a place that's unmistakably yours, part of your culture. And I think that is a big part of what we have to do next. Thank you.